Chapter 21 of the Pioneers, or the Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 21 Speed, my liege, speed! Such cause of haste thine active sinews never braced. Scott. The roads of Otsego, if we except the principal highways, were, at the early day of our tale, but little better than wood paths. The high trees that were growing on the very verge of the wheel tracks excluded the sun's rays, unless at meridian; and the slowness of the evaporation, united with the rich mold of vegetable decomposition that covered the whole country to the depth of several inches, occasioned but an indifferent foundation for the footing of travelers. Added to these were the inequalities of a natural surface, and the constant recurrence of enormous and slippery roots that were laid bare by the removal of the light soil, together with stumps of trees, to make a passage not only difficult but dangerous. Yet the riders among these numerous obstructions, which were such as would terrify an unpractised eye, gave no demonstrations of uneasiness as their horses toiled through the sloughs or trotted with uncertain paces along the dark route. In many places the marks on the trees were the only indications of a road, with perhaps an occasional remnant of a pine that, by being cut close to the earth, so as to leave nothing visible but its base of roots, spreading for 20 feet in every direction, was apparently placed there as a beacon to warn the traveler that it was the centre of a highway. Into one of these roads the active sheriff led the way, first striking out of the footpath, by which they had descended from the sugar bush, across a little bridge, formed of round logs laid loosely on sleepers of pine, in which large openings of a formidable width were frequent. The nag of Richard, when it reached one of these gaps, laid its nose along the logs and stepped across the difficult passage with the sagacity of a man; but the blooded filly which Miss Temple rode disdained so humble a movement. She made a step or two with an unusual caution, and then, on reaching the broadest opening, obedient to the curt and whip of her fearless mistress, she bounded across the dangerous pass with the activity of a squirrel. "Gently, gently, my child," said Marmaduke, who was following in the manner of Richard. "This is not a country for equestrian feats. Much prudence is requisite to journey through our rough paths with safety. Thou mayest practise thy skill in horsemanship on the plains of New Jersey with safety, but in the hills of Otsego they may be suspended for a time." "I may as well then relinquish my saddle at once, dear sir," returned his daughter; "for if it is to be laid aside until this wild country be improved, old age will overtake me, and put an end to what you term my equestrian feats." "Say not so, my child," returned her father; "but if thou venturest again, as in crossing this bridge, old age will never overtake thee, but I shall be left to mourn thee, cut off in thy prime, my Elizabeth. If thou hast seen this district of country as I did when it lay in the sleep of nature, and had witnessed its rapid changes as it awoke to supply the wants of man, thou wouldst curb thy impatience for a little time, though thou shouldst not check thy steed." "I recollect hearing you speak of your first visit to these woods, but the impression is faint, and blended with the confused images of childhood. Wild and unsettled as it may yet seem, it must have been 1,000 times more dreary then. Will you repeat, dear sir, what you then thought of your enterprise, and what you felt?" During this speech of Elizabeth, which was uttered with the fervor of affection, young Edwards rode more closely to the side of the Judge, and bent his dark eyes on his countenance, with an expression that seemed to read his thoughts. "Thou wast then young, my child, but must remember when I left thee and thy mother to take my first survey of these uninhabited mountains," said Marmaduke. "But thou dost not feel all the secret motives that can urge a man to endure privations in order to accumulate wealth. In my case they have not been trifling, and God has been pleased to smile on my efforts. If I have encountered pain, famine, and disease in accomplishing the settlement of this rough territory, I have not the misery of failure to add to the grievances." "Famine!" echoed Elizabeth; "I thought this was the land of abundance." Had you famine to contend with?" "Even so, my child," said her father. "Those who look around them now, and see the loads of produce that issue out of every wild path in these mountains during the season of travelling, will hardly credit that no more than 5 years have elapsed since the tenants of these woods were compelled to eat the scanty fruits of the forest to sustain life, and, with their unpractised skill, to hunt the beasts as food for their starving families." "Ay," cried Richard, who happened to overhear the last of this speech between the notes of the woodchopper's song, which he was endeavoring to breathe aloud. "That was the starving time, Cousin Bess." Author's insertion. The author has no better apology for interrupting the interest of a work of fiction by these desultory dialogues than that they have reference to facts. In reviewing his work, after so many years, he is compelled to confess it is injured by too many allusions to incidents that are not at all suited to satisfy the just expectations of the general reader. One of these events is slightly touched on in the commencement of this chapter. End author's insertion. "I grew as lank as a weasel that fall, and my face was as pale as one of your fever and ague visages. Monsieur Le Quoi there fell away like a pumpkin in drying, nor do I think you have got fairly over it yet, monsieur. Benjamin, I thought, bore it with a worse grace than any of the family, for he swore it was harder to endure than a short allowance in the calm latitudes. Benjamin is a sad fellow to swear if you starve him ever so little. I had half a mind to quit you then, 'Duke, and to go into Pennsylvania to fatten; but damn it, thinks I, we are sisters' children, and I will live or die with him after all." More than 30 years since a very near and dear relative of the writer, an elder sister and a second mother, was killed by a fall from a horse in a ride among the very mountains mentioned in this tale. Few of her sex and years were more extensively known or more universally beloved than the admirable woman who thus fell a victim to the chances of the wilderness. "I do not forget thy kindness," said Marmaduke, "nor that we are of one blood." "But, my dear father," cried the wondering Elizabeth, "was there actual suffering? Where were the beautiful and fertile vales of the Mohawk? Could they not furnish food for your wants?" "It was a season of scarcity. The necessities of life commanded a high price in Europe, and were greedily sought after by the speculators. The emigrants from the east to the west invariably passed along the valley of the Mohawk, and swept away the means of subsistence like a swarm of locusts. Nor were the people on the flats in a much better condition. They were in want themselves, but they spared the little excess of provisions that nature did not absolutely require, with the justice of the German character. There was no grinding of the poor. The word speculator was then unknown to them. I have seen many a stout man bending under the load of the bag of meal which he was carrying from the mills of the Mohawk through the rugged passes of these mountains to feed his half-famished children, with a heart so light, as he approached his hut, that the 30 miles he had passed seemed nothing. Remember, my child, it was in our very infancy. We had neither mills, nor grain, nor roads, nor often clearings. We had nothing of increase but the mouths that were to be fed. For even at that inauspicious moment the restless spirit of emigration was not idle. Nay, the general scarcity which extended to the east tended to increase the number of adventurers." "And how, dearest father, didst thou encounter this dreadful evil?" said Elizabeth, unconsciously adopting the dialect of her parent in the warmth of her sympathy. "Upon thee must have fallen the responsibility, if not the suffering." "It did, Elizabeth," returned the Judge, pausing for a single moment, as if musing on his former feelings. "I had hundreds at that dreadful time daily looking up to me for bread. The sufferings of their families, and the gloomy prospect before them, had paralyzed the enterprise and efforts of my settlers. Hunger drove them to the woods for food, but despair sent them at night, enfeebled and wan, to a sleepless pillow. It was not a moment for inaction. I purchased cargoes of wheat from the granaries of Pennsylvania. They were landed at Albany, and brought up the Mohawk in boats. From thence it was transported on pack horses into the wilderness, and distributed among my people. Seines were made, and the lakes and rivers were dragged for fish. Something like a miracle was wrought in our favor, for enormous shoals of herrings were discovered to have wandered 500 miles through the windings of the impetuous Susquehanna, and the lake was alive with their numbers. These were at length caught and dealt out to the people, with proper portions of salt, and from that moment we again began to prosper. Author's insertion. All this was literally true. End author's insertion. "Yes," cried Richard, "and I was the man who served out the fish and salt. When the poor devils came to receive their rations, Benjamin, who was my deputy, was obliged to keep them off by stretching ropes around me, for they smelt so of garlic, from eating nothing but the wild onion, that the fumes put me out often in my measurement. You were a child then, Bess, and knew nothing of the matter, for great care was observed to keep both you and your mother from suffering. That year put me back dreadfully, both in the breed of my hogs and of my turkeys." "No, Bess," cried the Judge in a more cheerful tone, disregarding the interruption of his cousin, "he who hears the settlement of a country knows but little of the toil and suffering by which it is accomplished. Unimproved and wild as this district now seems to your eyes, what was it when I first entered the hills? I left my party the morning of my arrival near the farms of the Cherry Valley, and, following a deer path, rode to the summit of the mountain that I have since called Mount Vision. For the sight that there met my eyes seemed to me as the deceptions of a dream. The fire had run over the pinnacle, and in a great measure laid open the view. The leaves were fallen, and I mounted a tree and sat for an hour looking on the silent wilderness. Not an opening was to be seen in the boundless forest, except where the lake lay, like a mirror of glass. The water was covered by myriads of the wildfowl that migrate with the changes in the season; and while in my situation on the branch of the beech, I saw a bear, with her cubs, descend to the shore to drink. I had met many deer, gliding through the woods, in my journey, but not the vestige of a man could I trace during my progress, nor from my elevated observatory. No clearing, no hut, none of the winding roads that are now to be seen, were there. Nothing but mountains rising behind mountains, and the valley, with its surface of branches enlivened here and there with the faded foliage of some tree that parted from its leaves with more than ordinary reluctance. Even the Susquehanna was then hid by the height and density of the forest. "And were you alone?" asked Elizabeth. "Passed you the night in that solitary state?" "Not so, my child," returned the father. "After musing on the scene for an hour, with a mingled feeling of pleasure and desolation, I left my perch and descended the mountain. My horse was left to browse on the twigs that grew within his reach, while I explored the shores of the lake and the spot where Templeton stands. A pine of more than ordinary growth stood where my dwelling is now placed. A windrow had been opened through the trees from thence to the lake, and my view was but little impeded. Under the branches of that tree I made my solitary dinner. I had just finished my repast, as I saw smoke curling from under the mountain, near the eastern bank of the lake. It was the only indication of the vicinity of man that I had then seen. After much toil I made my way to the spot, and found a rough cabin of logs, built against the foot of a rock, and bearing the marks of a tenant, though I found no one within it. "It was the hut of Leatherstocking," said Edwards quickly. "It was, though I at first supposed it to be a habitation of the Indians. But while I was lingering around the spot, Natty made his appearance, staggering under the carcass of a buck that he had slain. Our acquaintance commenced at that time. Before, I had never heard that such a being tenanted the woods. He launched his bark canoe and set me across the foot of the lake to the place where I had fastened my horse, and pointed out a spot where he might get a scanty browsing until the morning, when I returned and passed the night in the cabin of the hunter." Miss Temple was so much struck by the deep attention of young Edwards during this speech, that she forgot to resume her interrogations; but the youth himself continued the discourse by asking, "And how did the Leatherstocking discharge the duties of a host, sir?" "Why, simply but kindly, until late in the evening, when he discovered my name and object, and the cordiality of his manner very sensibly diminished, or I might better say, disappeared. He considered the introduction of the settlers as an innovation on his rights, I believe, for he expressed much dissatisfaction at the measure, though it was in his confused and ambiguous manner. I hardly understood his objections myself, but supposed they referred chiefly to an interruption of the hunting. "Had you then purchased the estate, or were you examining it with an intent to buy?" asked Edwards, a little abruptly. "It had been mine for several years. It was with a view to people the land that I visited the lake. Natty treated me hospitably, but coldly, I thought, after he learned the nature of my journey. I slept on his own bearskin, however, and in the morning joined my surveyors again." "Said he nothing of the Indian rights, sir? The Leatherstocking is much given to impeach the justice of the tenure by which the whites hold the country." "I remember that he spoke of them, but I did not nearly comprehend him, and may have forgotten what he said; for the Indian title was extinguished so far back as the close of the old war, and if it had not been at all, I hold under the patents of the royal governors, confirmed by an act of our own State Legislature, and no court in the country can affect my title." "Doubtless, sir, your title is both legal and equitable," returned the youth coldly, reining his horse back, and remaining silent till the subject was changed. It was seldom Mr. Jones suffered any conversation to continue for a great length of time without his participation. It seems that he was of the party that Judge Temple had designated as his surveyors, and he embraced the opportunity of the pause that succeeded the retreat of young Edwards to take up the discourse, and with a narration of their further proceedings after his own manner. As it wanted, however, the interest that had accompanied the description of the Judge, we must decline the task of committing his sentences to paper. They soon reached the point where the promised view was to be seen. It was one of those picturesque and peculiar scenes that belong to the Otsego, but which required the absence of the ice and the softness of a summer's landscape to be enjoyed in all its beauty. Marmaduke had early forewarned his daughter of the season, and of its effect on the prospect; and after casting a cursory glance at its capabilities, the party returned homeward, perfectly satisfied that its beauties would repay them for the toil of a second ride at a more propitious season. "The spring is the gloomy time of the American year," said the Judge, "and it is more peculiarly the case in these mountains. The winter seems to retreat to the fastnesses of the hills, as to the citadel of its dominion, and is only expelled after a tedious siege, in which either party, at times, would seem to be gaining the victory." "A very just and apposite figure, Judge Temple," observed the sheriff, "and the garrison under the command of Jack Frost make formidable sorties. You understand what I mean by sorties, monsieur, sallies in English, and sometimes drive General Spring and his troops back again into the Low Countries." "Yes, sir," returned the Frenchman, whose prominent eyes were watching the precarious footsteps of the beast he rode, as it picked its dangerous way among the roots of trees, holes, log bridges, and sloughs that formed the aggregate of the highway. "Je vous entends. The Low Country is freeze up for half the year." The error of Mr. Le Quoi was not noticed by the sheriff, and the rest of the party were yielding to the influence of the changeful season, which was already teaching the equestrians that a continuance of its mildness was not to be expected for any length of time. Silence and thoughtfulness succeeded the gaiety and conversation that had prevailed during the commencement of the ride, as clouds began to gather about the heavens, apparently collecting from every quarter, in quick motion, without the agency of a breath of air. While riding over one of the cleared eminencies that occurred in their route, the watchful eye of Judge Temple pointed out to his daughter the approach of a tempest. Flurries of snow already obscured the mountain that formed the northern boundary of the lake, and the genial sensation which had quickened the blood through their veins was already succeeded by the deadening influence of an approaching northwester. All of the party were now busily engaged in making the best of their way to the village, though the badness of the roads frequently compelled them to check the impatience of their animals, which often carried them over places that would not admit of any gait faster than a walk. Richard continued in advance, followed by Mr. Le Quoi, next to whom rode Elizabeth, who seemed to have imbibed the distance which pervaded the manner of young Edwards since the termination of the discourse between the latter and her father. Marmaduke followed his daughter, giving her frequent and tender warnings as to the management of her horse. It was, possibly, the evident dependence that Louisa Grant placed on his assistance, which induced the youth to continue by her side, as they pursued their way through a dreary and dark wood, where the rays of the sun could but rarely penetrate, and where even the daylight was obscured and rendered gloomy by the deep forests that surrounded them. No wind had yet reached the spot where the equestrians were in motion, but that dead silence that often precedes a storm contributed to render their situation more irksome than if they were already subject to the fury of the tempest. Suddenly the voice of young Edwards was heard shouting in those appalling tones that carry alarm to the very soul, and which curdle the blood of those that hear them. "A tree! A tree! Whip, spur for your lives! A tree! A tree! A tree! A tree!" echoed Richard, giving his horse a blow that caused the alarmed beast to jump nearly a rod, throwing the mud and water into the air like a hurricane. "Von tree! Von tree!" shouted the Frenchman, bending his body on the neck of his charger, shutting his eyes, and playing on the ribs of his beast with his heels at a rate that caused him to be conveyed on the crupper of the sheriff with a marvellous speed. Elizabeth checked her filly and looked up with an unconscious but alarmed air at the very cause of their danger, while she listened to the crackling sounds that awoke the stillness of the forest. But the next instant her bridlet was seized by her father, who cried, "God protect my child!" and she felt herself hurried onward, impelled by the vigor of his nervous arm. Each one of the party bowed to his saddle bows, as the tearing of the branches was succeeded by a sound like the rushing of the winds, which was followed by a thundering report, and a shock that caused the very earth to tremble, as one of the noblest ruins of the forest fell directly across their path. One glance was enough to assure Judge Temple that his daughter and those in front of him were safe, and he turned his eyes in dreadful anxiety to learn the fate of the others. Young Edwards was on the opposite side of the tree, his form thrown back in his saddle to its utmost distance, his left hand drawing up his bridle with its greatest force, while the right grasped that of Miss Grant so as to draw the head of her horse under its body. Both the animals stood shaking in every joint with terror, and snorting fearfully. Louisa herself had relinquished her reins, and with her hands pressed on her face, sat bending forward in her saddle, in an attitude of despair mingled strangely with resignation. "Are you safe?" cried the Judge, first breaking the awful silence of the moment. "By God's blessing," returned the youth; "but if there had been branches to the tree, we must have been lost." He was interrupted by the figure of Louisa slowly yielding in her saddle, and but for his arm she would have sunk to the earth. Terror, however, was the only injury that the clergyman's daughter had sustained, and with the aid of Elizabeth she was soon restored to her senses. After some little time was lost in recovering her strength, the young lady was replaced in her saddle, and, supported on either side by Judge Temple and Mr. Edwards, she was enabled to follow the party in their slow progress. "The sudden fallings of the trees," said Marmaduke, "are the most dangerous accidents in the forest, for they are not to be foreseen, being impelled by no winds, nor any extraneous or visible cause against which we can guard." "Their reason for their falling, Judge Temple, is very obvious," said the sheriff. "The tree is old and decayed, and it is gradually weakened by the frosts, until a line drawn from the centre of gravity falls without its base, and then the tree comes of a certainty. And I should like to know what greater compulsion there can be for any thing than a mathematical certainty. I studied math—" "Very true, Richard," interrupted Marmaduke, "thy reasoning is true, and, if my memory be not over treacherous, was furnished by myself on a former occasion. But how is one to guard against the danger? Canst thou go through the forests, measuring the bases and calculating the centres of the oaks? Answer me that, friend Jones, and I will say thou wilt do the country a service." "Answer thee that, friend Temple," returned Richard. "A well-educated man can answer thee anything, sir. Do any trees fall in this manner but such as are decayed? Take care not to approach the roots of a rotten tree, and you will be safe enough." "That would be excluding us entirely from the forests," said Marmaduke. "But happily the winds usually force down most of these dangerous ruins, as their currents are admitted into the woods by the surrounding clearings, and such a fall as this has been is very rare." Louisa by this time had recovered so much strength as to allow the party to proceed at a quicker pace, but long before they were safely housed they were overtaken by the storm, and when they dismounted at the door of the mansion-house, the black plumes of Miss Temple's hat were drooping with the weight of a load of damp snow, and the coats of the gentlemen were powdered with the same material. While Edwards was assisting Louisa from her horse, the warm-hearted girl caught his hand with fervor, and whispered, "Now, Mr. Edwards, both father and daughter owe their lives to you." A driving northwesterly storm succeeded, and before the sun was set every vestige of spring had vanished, the lake, the mountains, the village, and the fields being again hidden under one dazzling coat of snow. Chapter 21. Recording by Bill Borst. Of the Pioneers, or the Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 22. Men, boys, and girls desert the unpeopled village, and wild crowds spread o'er the plain, by the sweet frenzy driven. Somerville. From this time to the close of April, the weather continued to be a succession of neat and rapid changes. One day the soft airs of spring seemed to be stealing along the valley, and in unison with an invigorating sun, attempting covertly to rouse the dormant powers of the vegetable world, while, on the next, the surly blasts from the north would sweep across the lake and erase every impression left by their gentle adversaries. The snow, however, finally disappeared, and the green wheat fields were seen in every direction, spotted with the dark and charred stumps that had, the preceding season, supported some of the proudest trees of the forest. Ploughs were in motion, wherever those useful implements could be used, and the smokes of the sugar camps were no longer seen issuing from the woods of maple. The lake had lost the beauty of a field of ice, but still a dark and gloomy covering concealed its waters, for the absence of currents left them yet hidden under a porous crust, which, saturated with the fluid, barely retained enough strength to preserve the continuity of its parts. Large flocks of wild geese were seen passing over the country, which hovered for a time around the hidden sheet of water, apparently searching for a resting place, and then, on finding themselves excluded by the chill covering, would soar away to the north, filling the air with discordant screams, as if venting their complaints at the tardy operations of nature. For a week, the dark covering of the Otsego was left to the undisturbed possession of two eagles, who alighted on the center of its field, and sat eyeing their undisputed territory. During the presence of these monarchs of the air, the flocks of migrating birds avoided crossing the plain of ice by turning into the hills, apparently seeking the protection of the forests, while the white and bald heads of the tenants of the lake were turned upward with a look of contempt. But the time had come when even these kings of birds were to be dispossessed. An opening had been gradually increasing at the lower extremity of the lake, and around the dark spot where the current of the river prevented the formation of ice during even the coldest weather, and the fresh southerly winds that now breathed freely upon the valley made an impression on the waters. Mimic waves began to curl over the margin of the frozen field, which exhibited an outline of crystallizations that slowly receded toward the north. At each step the power of the winds and the waves increased, until, after a struggle of a few hours, the turbulent little billows succeeded in setting the whole field in motion, when it was driven beyond the reach of the eye, with a rapidity that was as magical as the change produced in the scene by this expulsion of the lingering remnant of winter. Just as the last sheet of agitated ice was disappearing in the distance, the eagles rose, and soared with a wide sweep above the clouds, while the waves tossed their little caps of snow in the air, as if rioting in their release from a thraldom of 5 minutes' duration. The following morning Elizabeth was awakened by the exhilarating sounds of the martins, who were quarrelling and chattering around the little boxes suspended above her windows, and the cries of Richard, who was calling in tones animating as signs of the season itself. "Awake, awake, my fair lady! The gulls are hovering over the lake already, and the heavens are alive with pigeons. You may look an hour before you can find a hole through which to get a peep at the sun. Awake, awake, lazy ones! Benjamin is overhauling the ammunition, and we only wait for our breakfasts, and away for the mountains and pigeon shooting." There was no resisting this animated appeal, and in a few minutes Miss Temple and her friend descended to the parlor. The doors of the hall were thrown open, and the mild, balmy air of a clear spring morning was ventilating the apartment, where the vigilance of the ex-steward had been so long maintaining an artificial heat with such unremitted diligence. The gentlemen were impatiently waiting for their morning's repast, each equipped in the garb of a sportsman. Mr. Jones made many visits to the southern door, and would cry, "See, Cousin Bess, see! 'Duke, the pigeon roosts of the south have broken up. They are growing more thick every instant. Here is a flock that the eye cannot see the end of. There is food enough in it to keep the army of Xerxes for a month, and feathers enough to make beds for the whole country." Xerxes, Mr. Edwards, was a Grecian king no, he was a Turk, or a Persian, who wanted to conquer Greece, just the same as these rascals will overrun our wheat fields, when they come back in the fall. Away, away! Bess, I long to pepper them." In this wish both Marmaduke and young Edwards seemed equally to participate, for the sight was exhilarating to a sportsman, and the ladies soon dismissed the party after a hasty breakfast. If the heavens were alive with pigeons, the whole village seemed equally in motion with men, women, and children. Every species of firearm, from the French ducking gun, with a barrel near 6 feet in length, to the common horseman's pistol, was to be seen in the hands of the men and boys; while bows and arrows, some made of the simple stick of walnut sapling, and others in a rude imitation of the ancient crossbows, were carried by many of the latter. The houses and the signs of life apparent in the village drove the alarmed birds from the direct line of their flight, toward the mountains, along the sides and near the bases of which they were glancing in dense masses, equally wonderful by the rapidity of their motion and their incredible numbers. We have already said that, across the inclined plane which fell from the steep ascent of the mountain to the banks of the Susquehanna, ran the highway on either side of which a clearing of many acres had been made at a very early day. Over those clearings, and up the eastern mountain, and along the dangerous path that was cut into its side, the different individuals posted themselves, and in a few moments the attack commenced. Among the sportsmen was the tall, gaunt form of Leatherstocking, walking over the field, with his rifle hanging on his arm, his dogs at his heels; the latter now scenting the dead or wounded birds that were beginning to tumble from the flocks, and then crouching under the legs of their master, as if they participated in his feelings at this wasteful and unsportsmanlike execution. The reports of the firearms became rapid, whole volleys rising from the plain, as flocks of more than ordinary numbers darted over the opening, shadowing the field like a cloud, and then the light smoke of a single piece would issue from among the leafless bushes on the mountain, as death was hurled on the retreat of the affrighted birds, who were rising from a volley, in a vain effort to escape. Arrows and missiles of every kind were in the midst of the flocks, and so numerous were the birds, and so low did they take their flight, that even long poles in the hands of those on the sides of the mountain were used to strike them to the earth. During all this time, Mr. Jones, who disdained the humble and ordinary means of destruction used by his companions, was busily occupied, aided by Benjamin, in making arrangements for an assault of more than ordinarily fatal character. Among the relics of the old military excursions, that occasionally are discovered throughout the different districts of the western part of New York, there had been found in Templeton, at its settlement, a small swivel, which would carry a ball of a pound weight. It was thought to have been deserted by a war party of the whites in one of their inroads into the Indian settlements, when perhaps convenience or their necessity induced them to leave such an encumbrance behind them in the woods. This miniature cannon had been released from the rust, and being mounted on little wheels was now in a state for actual service. For several years it was the sole organ for extraordinary rejoicings used in those mountains. On the mornings of the 4th of July it would be heard ringing among the hills, and even Captain Hollister, who was the highest authority in that part of the country on all such occasions, affirmed that, considering its dimensions, it was no despicable gun for a salute. It was somewhat the worse for the service it had performed, it is true, there being but a trifling difference in size between the touch-hole and the muzzle. Still, the grand conceptions of Richard had suggested the importance of such an instrument in hurling death at his nimble enemies. The swivel was dragged by a horse into a part of the open space that the sheriff thought most eligible for planning a battery of the kind, and Mr. Pump proceeded to load it. Several handfuls of duck-shot were placed on top of the powder, and the major domo announced that his piece was ready for service. The sight of such an implement collected all the idle spectators to the spot, who, being mostly boys, filled the air with cries of exultation and delight. The gun was pointed high, and Richard, holding a coal of fire in a pair of tongs, patiently took his seat on a stump, awaiting the appearance of a flock worthy of his notice. So prodigious was the number of the birds that the scattering fire of the guns, with the hurling of missiles and the cries of the boys, had no other effect than to break off small flocks from the immense masses that continued to dart along the valley, as if the whole of the feathered tribe were pouring through that one pass. None pretended to collect the game, which lay scattered over the fields in such profusion as to cover the very ground with fluttering victims. Leatherstocking was a silent but uneasy spectator of all these proceedings, but was able to keep his sentiments to himself until he saw the introduction of the swivel into the sports. "This comes of settling a country," he said. "Here I have known the pigeon to fly for 40 long years, and, till you made your clearings, there was nobody to skeert or to hurt them. I loved to see them come into the woods, for they were company to a body, hurting nothing, being, as it was, as harmless as a garter snake. But now it gives me sore thoughts when I hear the frighty things whizzing through the air, for I know it's only a motion to bring out all the brats of the village. Well, the Lord won't see the waste of his creatures for nothing, and right will be done to the pigeons, as well as others, by and by. There's Mr. Oliver as bad as the rest of them, firing into the flocks as if he was shooting down nothing but Mingo warriors." Among the sportsmen was Billy Kirby, who, armed with an old musket, was loading, and, without even looking into the air, was firing and shouting as his victims fell even on his own person. He heard the speech of Natty, and took upon himself to reply. "What, old Leatherstocking," he cried, "grumbling at the loss of a few pigeons? If you had to sow your wheat twice and 3 times, as I have done, you wouldn't be so massifully feeling toward the devils. Hurrah, boys, scatter the feathers. This is better than shooting at a turkey's head and neck, old fellow." "It's better for you, maybe, Billy Kirby," replied the indignant old hunter, "and all them that don't know how to put a ball down a rifle barrel, or how to bring it up again with a true aim. But it's wicked to be shooting into flocks in this wasty manner, and none to do it who know how to knock over a single bird. If a body has a craving for pigeon's flesh, why, it's made the same as all other creatures, for man's eating, but not to kill 20 and eat one. When I want such a thing, I go into the woods till I find one to my liking, and then I shoot him off the branches, without touching the feather of another, though there might be 100 on the same tree. You couldn't do such a thing, Billy Kirby. You couldn't do it if you tried." "What's that, old cornstalk, you sapless stub?" cried the woodchopper. "You have grown wordy since the affair of the turkey; but if you are for a single shot, here goes at that bird which comes on by himself." The fire from the distant part of the field had driven a single pigeon below the flock to which it belonged, and, frightened with the constant reports of the muskets, it was approaching the spot where the disputants stood, darting first from one side and then to the other, cutting the air with the swiftness of lightning, and making a noise with its wings not unlike the rushing of a bullet. Unfortunately for the woodchopper, notwithstanding his vaunt, he did not see this bird until it was too late to fire as it approached, and he pulled the trigger at the unlucky moment, when it was darting immediately over his head. The bird continued its course with the usual velocity. Natty lowered his rifle from his arm when the challenge was made, and waiting a moment until the terrified victim had got in a line with his eye, and had dropped near the bank of the lake, he raised it again with uncommon rapidity, and fired. It might have been chance, or it might have been skill, that produced the result. It was probably a union of both; but the pigeon whirled over in the air, and fell into the lake with a broken wing. At the sound of his rifle, both his dogs started from his feet, and in a few minutes the slut brought out the bird still alive. The wonderful exploit of Leatherstocking was noised through the field with great rapidity, and the sportsmen gathered in, to learn the truth of the report. "What," said young Edwards, "have you really killed a pigeon on the wing, Natty, with a single ball?" "Haven't I killed loons before now, lad, that dive at the flash?" returned the hunter. "It's much better to kill only such as you want, without wasting your powder and lead, than to be firing into God's creatures in this wicked manner. But I came out for a bird, and you know the reason why I like small game, Mr. Oliver; and now I have got one, 'twill go home, for I don't relish to see these wasty ways that you are all practising, as if the least thing wasn't made for use, and not to destroy." "Thou sayest well, Leatherstocking," cried Marmaduke, "and I begin to think it time to put an end to this work of destruction." "Put an ind, Judge, to your clearings. Ain't the woods his work as well as the pigeons? Use, but don't waste. Wasn't the woods made for the beasts and birds to harbor in? And when man wanted their flesh, their skins, or their feathers, there's the place to seek them. But I'll go to the hut with my own game, for I wouldn't touch one of the harmless things that cover the ground here, looking up with their eyes on me, as if they only wanted tongues to say their thoughts." With this sentiment in his mouth, Leatherstocking threw his rifle over his arm, and, followed by his dogs, stepped across the clearing with great caution, taking care not to tread on one of the wounded birds in his path. He soon entered the bushes on the margin of the lake, and was hid from view. Whatever impression the morality of Natty made on the Judge, it was utterly lost on Richard. He availed himself of the gathering of the sportsmen to lay a plan for one fell swoop of destruction. The musketmen were drawn up in battle array, in a line extending on each side of his artillery, with orders to await the signal of firing from himself. "Stand by, my lads," said Benjamin, who acted as an aide de camp on this occasion. "Stand by, my hearties, and when Squire Dickens heaves out the signal to begin firing, d'ye see, you may open upon them in a broadside. Take care and fire low, boys, and you'll be sure to hold the flock." "Fire low!" shouted Kirby. "Hear the old fool! If we fire low, we may hit the stumps, but not ruffle a pigeon." "How should you know, you lubber?" cried Benjamin, with a very unbecoming heat for an officer on the eve of battle. "How should you know, you grampus? Haven't I sailed aboard of the Boadishey for 5 years, and wasn't it a standing order to fire low, and to hull your enemy? Keep silence at your guns, boys, and mind the order that is passed." The loud laughs of the musketmen were silenced by the more authoritative voice of Richard, who called for attention and obedience to his signals. Some millions of pigeons were supposed to have already passed that morning over the valley of Templeton, but nothing like the flock that was now approaching had been seen before. It extended from mountain to mountain in one solid blue mass, and the eye looked in vain over the southern hills to find its termination. The front of this living column was distinctly marked by a line, but very slightly indented, so regular and even was the flight. Even Marmaduke forgot the morality of Leatherstocking as it approached, and, in common with the rest, brought his musket to a poise. "Fire!" cried the sheriff, clapping a coal to the priming of the cannon. As half of Benjamin's charge escaped through the touch hole, the whole volley of the musketry preceded the report of the swivel. On receiving this united discharge of small arms, the front of the flock darted upward, while at the same instant myriads of those in the rear rushed with amazing rapidity into their places, so that when the column of white smoke gushed from the mouth of the little cannon, an accumulated mass of objects was gliding over its point of direction. The roar of the gun echoed along the mountains, and died away to the north like distant thunder, while the whole flock of alarmed birds seemed for a moment thrown into one disorderly and agitated mass. The air was filled with their irregular flight. layer rising above layer, far above the tops of the highest pines, none daring to advance beyond the dangerous pass, when suddenly some of the headers of the feathered tribes shot across the valley, taking their flight directly over the village, and hundreds of thousands in their rear followed the example, deserting the eastern side of the plain to their persecutors and the slain. "Victory!" shouted Richard. "Victory! We have driven the enemy from the field." "Not so, Dickon," said Marmaduke; "the field is covered with them; and, like the Leatherstocking, I see nothing but eyes in every direction, as the innocent sufferers turn their heads in terror. Full one half of those that have fallen are yet alive, and I think it is time to end the sport, if sport it be." "Sport!" cried the sheriff; "it is princely sport. There are some thousands of the blue-coated boys on the ground, so that every old woman in the village may have a pot-pie for the asking." "Well, we have happily frightened the birds from this side of the valley," said Marmaduke, "and the carnage must of necessity end for the present. Boys, I will give you 6 pence a hundred for the pigeons' heads only; so go to work, and bring them into the village." This expedient produced the desired effect, for every urchin on the ground went industriously to work to wring the necks of the wounded birds. Judge Temple retired toward his dwelling with that kind of feeling that many a man has experienced before him, who discovers, after the excitement of the moment has passed, that he has purchased pleasure at the price of misery to others. Horses were loaded with the dead, and after this first burst of sporting, the shooting of pigeons became a business, with a few idlers, for the remainder of the season. Richard, however, boasted for many a year of his shot with the cricket, and Benjamin gravely asserted that he thought they had killed nearly as many pigeons on that day as there were Frenchmen destroyed on the memorable occasion of Rodney's victory. Chapter 22. Recording by Bill Borst. Of the Pioneers, or The Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 23. "Help, masters, help! There's a fish hangs in the net, like a poor man's right in the law." Pericles of Tyre. The advance of the season now became as rapid as its first approach had been tedious and lingering. The days were uniformly mild, while the nights, though cool, were no longer chilled by frosts. The whippoorwill was heard whistling his melancholy notes along the margin of the lake, and the ponds and meadows were sending forth the music of their thousand tenants. The leaf of the native poplar was seen quivering in the woods. The sides of the mountains began to lose their hue of brown, as the lively green of the different members of the forest blended their shades with the permanent colors of the pine and hemlock. And even the buds of the tardy oak were swelling with the promise of the coming summer. The gay and fluttering bluebird, the social robin, and the industrious little wren were all to be seen enlivening the fields with their presence and their songs, while the soaring fish-hawk was already hovering over the waters of the Otsego, watching with native voracity for the appearance of his prey. The tenants of the lake were far famed for both their quantities and their quality, and the ice had hardly disappeared before numberless little boats were launched from the shores, and the lines of the fishermen were dropped into the inmost recesses of its deepest caverns, tempting the unwary animals with every variety of bait that the ingenuity or the art of man had invented. But the slow, though certain adventures with hook and line were ill suited to the profusion and impatience of the settlers. More destructive means were resorted to; and, as the season had now arrived when the bass fisheries were allowed by the provisions of the law that Judge Temple had procured, the sheriff declared his intention, by availing himself of the first dark night, to enjoy the sport in person. "And you shall be present, Cousin Bess," he added, when he announced this design, "and Miss Grant, and Mr. Edwards, and I will show you what I call fishing, not nibble, 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 as 'Duke does when he goes after the salmon trout. There he will sit for hours in a broiling sun, or perhaps over a hole in the lee, in the coldest days in winter, under the lee of a few bushes, and not a fish will he catch, after all this mortification of the flesh. No, no, Give me a good seine that's 50 or 60 fathoms in length, with a jolly parcel of boatmen to crack their jokes the while, with Benjamin to steer, and let us haul them in by thousands. I call that fishing." "Ah, Dickon," cried Marmaduke, "thou knowest but little of the pleasure there is in playing with the hook and line, or thou wouldst be more saving of the game. I have known thee to leave fragments enough behind thee, when thou hast headed a night party on the lake, to feed a dozen famishing families." "I shall not dispute the matter, Judge Temple. This night will I go, and I invite the company to attend, and then let them decide between us." Richard was busy during most of the afternoon, making his preparations for the important occasion. Just as the light of the settling sun had disappeared, and a new moon had begun to throw its shadows on the earth, the fishermen took their departure, in a boat, for a point that was situated on the western shore of the lake, at the distance of rather more than half a mile from the village. The ground had become settled, and the walking was good and dry. Marmaduke, with his daughter, her friend, and young Edwards, continued on the high grassy banks at the outlet of the placid sheet of water, watching the dark object that was moving across the lake, until it entered the shade of the western hills, and was lost to the eye. The distance round by land to the point of destination was a mile, and he observed, "It is time for us to be moving. The moon will be down ere we reach the point, and then the miraculous hauls of Dickon will commence." The evening was warm, and after the long and dreary winter from which they had just escaped, delightfully invigorating. Inspirited by the scene of their anticipated amusement, the youthful companions of the Judge followed his steps, as he led them along the shores of the Otsego, and through the skirts of the village. "See," said young Edwards, "they are building their fire already. It glimmers for a moment, and dies again like the light of a firefly." "Now it blazes," cried Elizabeth. "You can perceive figures moving around the light. Oh, I would bet my jewels against the gold beads of Remarkable that my impatient cousin Dickon had an agency in raising that bright flame. And see, it fades again, like most of his brilliant schemes." "Thou hast guessed the truth, Bess," said her father. "He has thrown an armful of brush on the pile, which has burnt out as soon as lighted. But it has enabled them to find a better fuel, for their fire begins to blaze with a more steady flame. It is the true fisherman's beacon now. Observe how beautifully it throws its little circle of light on the water." The appearance of the fire urged the pedestrians on, for even the ladies had become eager to witness the miraculous draught. By the time they reached the bank, which rose above the low point where the fishermen had landed, the moon had sunk behind the top of the western pines, and, as most of the stars were obscured by clouds, there was but little other light than that which proceeded from the fire. At the suggestion of Marmaduke, his companions paused to listen to the conversation of those below them, and examine the party for a moment before they descended to the shore. The whole group were seated around the fire, with the exception of Richard and Benjamin, the former of whom occupied the root of a decayed stump that had been drawn to the spot as part of their fuel, and the latter was standing with his arms akimbo, so near to the flame that the smoke occasionally obscured his solemn visage, as it waved around the pile in obedience to the night airs that swept gently over the water. "Why, look you, squire," said the major domo, "you may call a lake fish that will weigh 20 or 30 pounds a serious matter, but to a man who has hauled in a shovel-nosed shirk, d'ye see, it's but a poor kind of fishing after all." "I don't know, Benjamin," returned the sheriff. "A haul of 1,000 Otsego bass, without counting pike, pickerel, perch, bullpouts, salmon trouts, and suckers, is no bad fishing, let me tell you. There may be sport in sticking a shark, but what is he good for after you have got him? Now, any one of the fish that I have named is fit to set before a king." "Well, squire," returned Benjamin, "just listen to the philosophy of the thing. Would it stand to reason that such a fish should live and be catched in this here little pond of water, where it's hardly deep enough to drown a man, as you'll find in the wide ocean, where, as everybody knows, that is, everybody that has followed the seas, whales and grampuses are to be seen, that are as long as one of the pine trees on yonder mountain?" "Softly, softly, Benjamin," said the sheriff, as if he wished to save the credit of his favorite. "Why, some of the pines will measure 200 feet, and even more." 200 or 2,000, it's all the same thing," cried Benjamin, with an air which manifested that he was not easily to be bullied out of his opinion on a subject like the present. "Haven't I been there, and haven't I seen? I have said that you fall in with whales as long as one of them there pines, and what I have once said I'll stand to." During this dialogue, which was evidently but the close of much longer discussion, the huge frame of Billy Kirby was seen extended on one side of the fire, where he was picking his teeth with splinters of the chips near him, and occasionally shaking his head with distrust of Benjamin's assertions. "I've a notion," said the wood chopper, "that there's water in this lake to swim the biggest whale that ever was invented; and as to the pines, I think I ought to know something consarning them. I have chopped many a one that was 60 times the length of my helve, without counting the eye; and I believe, Benny, that if the old pine that stands in the hollow of the Vision Mountain just over the village, you may see the tree itself by looking up, for the moon is on its top yet. Well, now I believe, if that same tree was planted out in the deepest part of the lake, there would be water enough for the biggest ship that ever was built to float over it, without touching its upper branches, I do." "Did ye ever see a ship, Master Kirby?" roared the steward. "Did ye ever see a ship, man, or any craft bigger than a lime scow, or a wood boat, on this here small bit of fresh water?" "Yes, I have," said the wood chopper stoutly. "I can say that I have, and tell no lie." "Did ye ever see a British ship, Master Kirby, an English line of battle ship, boy? Where did ye ever fall in with a regular built vessel, with starn post, and cutwater, garboard streak, and plank sheer, gangways, and hatchways, and waterways, quarter deck, and forecastle, ay, and flush deck? Tell me that, man, if you can. Where away did ye ever fall in with a full rigged, regular built, necked vessel?" The whole company were a good deal astounded with this overwhelming question, and even Richard afterward remarked that it was 1,000 pities that Benjamin could not read, or he must have made a valuable officer to the British marine. It is no wonder that they overcame the French so easily on the water, when even the lowest sailor so well understood the different parts of a vessel. But Billy Kirby was a fearless wight, and had great jealousy of foreign dictation. He had risen on his feet, and turned his back to the fire, during the valuable delivery of this interrogatory, and when the steward ended, contrary to all expectation, he gave the following spirited reply: "Where? Why, on the North River, and maybe on Champlain. There's sloops on the river, boy, that would give a hard time on it to the stoutest vessel King George owns. They carry masts of 90 feet in the clear of good solid pine, for I've been at the chopping of many a one in Varmount State. I wish I was captain in one of them, and you was in that board dish that you talk so much about, and we'd soon see what good Yankee stuff is made on, and whether a Vermonter's hide ain't as thick as an Englishman's." The echoes from the opposite hills, which were more than half a mile from the fishing point, sent back the discordant laugh that Benjamin gave forth at this challenge, and the woods that covered their sides seemed, by the noise that issued from their shades, to be full of mocking demons. "Let us descend to the shore," whispered Marmaduke, "or there will soon be ill blood between them. Benjamin is a fearless boaster, and Kirby, though good-natured, is a careless son of the forest, who thinks one American more than a match for 6 Englishmen. I marvel that Dickon is silent, where there is such a trial of skill in the superlative." The appearance of Judge Temple and the ladies produced, if not a pacification, at least a cessation of hostilities. Obedient to the directions of Mr. Jones, the fishermen prepared to launch their boat, which had been seen in the background of the view, with the net carefully disposed on a little platform in its stern, ready for service. Richard gave vent to his reproaches at the tardiness of the pedestrians, when all the turbulent passions of the party were succeeded by a calm, as mild and as placid as that which prevailed over the beautiful sheet of water that they were about to rifle of its best treasures. The night had now become so dark as to render objects, without the reach of the light of the fire, not only indistinct, but in most cases invisible. For a little distance the water was discernible, glistening, as the glare from the fire danced over its surface, touching it here and there with red quivering streaks. But at 100 feet from the shore there lay a boundary of impenetrable gloom. 1 or 2 stars were shining through the openings of the clouds, and the lights were seen in the village, glimmering faintly, as if at an immeasurable distance. At times, as the fire lowered, or as the horizon cleared, the outline of the mountain, on the other side of the lake, might be traced by its undulations, but its shadow was cast, wide and dense, on the bosom of the water, rendering the darkness in that direction trebly deep. Benjamin Pump was invariably the coxswain and net-caster of Richard's boat, unless the sheriff saw fit to preside in person, and on the present occasion Billy Kirby and a youth of about half his strength were assigned to the oars. The remainder of the assistants were stationed at the drag ropes. The arrangements were speedily made, and Richard gave the signal to shove off. Elizabeth watched the motion of the batteau as it pulled from the shore, letting loose its rope as it went, but it soon disappeared in the darkness, when the ear was her only guide to its evolutions. There was great affectation of stillness during all these manoeuvres, in order, as Richard assured them, not to frighten the bass who were running into the shoal waters, and who would approach the light if not disturbed by the sounds from the fishermen. The hoarse voice of Benjamin was alone heard issuing out of the gloom, as he uttered in authoritative tones, "Pull larboard oar! Pull starboard! Give way together, boys!" and such other indicative mandates as were necessary for the right disposition of his seine. A long time was passed in this necessary part of the process, for Benjamin prided himself greatly on his skill in throwing the net, and in fact most of the success of the sport depended on its being done with judgment. At length a loud splash in the water, as he threw away the staff or stretcher, with a hoarse call from the steward of clear, announced that the boat was returning, when Richard seized a brand from the fire, and ran to a point as far above the centre of the fishing ground as the one from which the batteau had started was below it. "Stick her in dead for the squire, boys," said the steward, "and we'll have a look at what grows in this here pond." In place of the falling net were now to be heard the quick strokes of the oars, and the noise of the rope running out of the boat. Presently the batteau shot into the circle of light, and in an instant she was pulled to the shore. Several eager hands were extended to receive the line, and both ropes being equally well manned, the fishermen commenced hauling in with slow and steady drags, Richard standing to the centre, giving orders, first to one party and then to the other, to increase or slacken their efforts, as occasion required. The visitors were posted near him, and enjoyed a fair view of the whole operation, which was slowly advancing to an end. Opinions as to the result of their adventure were now freely hazarded by all the men, some declaring that the net came in as light as a feather, and others affirming that it seemed to be full of logs. As the ropes were many hundred feet in length, these opposing sentiments were thought to be of little moment by the sheriff, who would go first to one line and then to the other, giving each small pulls, in order to enable him to form an opinion for himself. "Why, Benjamin," he cried, as he made his first effort in this way, "you did not throw the net clear. I can move it with my little finger. The rope slackens in my hand." "Did you ever see a whale, squire?" responded the steward. "I say that, if that there net is foul, the devil is in the lake in the shape of a fish, for I cast it as far as ever rigging was rove over the quarter deck of a flagship." But Richard discovered his mistake when he saw Billy Kirby before him, standing with his feet in the water, at an angle of 45 degrees, inclining southward, and expending his gigantic strength in sustaining himself in that posture. He ceased his remonstrances, and proceeded to the party at the other line. "I see the staffs!" shouted Mr. Jones. "Gather in, boys, and away with it. To shore with her! To shore with her!" At this cheerful sound, Elizabeth strained her eyes and saw the ends of the 2 sticks on the seine emerging from the darkness, while the men closed near to each other, and formed a deep bag of their net. The exertions of the fishermen sensibly increased, and the voice of Richard was heard encouraging them to make their greatest efforts at the present moment. "Now's the time, my lads," he cried. "Let us get the ends to land, and all we have will be our own. Away with her!" "Away with her it is," echoed Benjamin. "Hurrah! Ho-a-hay! Ho-a-hay! Ho-ah!" "In with her!" shouted Kirby, exerting himself in a manner that left nothing for those in his rear to do but to gather up the slack of the rope which passed through his hands. "Staff ho!" shouted the steward. "Staff ho!" echoed Kirby from the other rope. The men rushed to the water's edge, some seizing the upper rope and some the lower or lead rope, and began to haul with great activity and zeal. A deep semicircular sweep of the little balls that supported the seine in its perpendicular position was plainly visible to the spectators, and as it rapidly lessened in size, the bag of the net appeared, while an occasional flutter on the water announced the uneasiness of the prisoners it contained. "Haul in, my lads!" shouted Richard. "I can see the dogs kicking to get free. Haul in, and here's a cast that will pay for the labor." Fishes of various sorts were now to be seen, entangled in the meshes of the net, as it was passed through the hands of the laborers; and the water, at a little distance from the shore, was alive with the movements of the alarmed victims. Hundreds of white sides were glancing up to the surface of the water, and glistening in the firelight, when, frightened at the uproar and the change, the fish would again dart to the bottom in fruitless efforts for freedom. "Hurrah!" shouted Richard. "One or two more heavy drags, boys, and we are safe." "Cheerily, boys, cheerily!" cried Benjamin. "I see a salmon trout that is big enough for a chowder." "Away with you, varmint," said Billy Kirby, plucking a bullpout from the meshes, and casting the animal back into the lake with contempt. "Pull, boys, pull! Here's all kinds, and the Lord condemn me for a liar if there ain't 1,000 bass." Inflamed beyond the bounds of discretion at the sight, and forgetful of the season, the wood chopper rushed to his middle into the water, and began to drive the reluctant animals before him from their native element. "Pull heartily, boys!" cried Marmaduke, yielding to the excitement of the moment, and laying his hands to the net with no trifling addition to the force. Edwards had preceded him, for the sight of the immense piles of fish that were slowly rolling over on the gravelly beach had impelled him also to leave the ladies and join the fishermen. Great care was observed in bringing the net to land, and after much toil the whole shoal of victims was safely deposited in a hollow of the bank, where they were left to flutter away their brief existence in the new and fatal element. Even Elizabeth and Louisa were greatly excited and highly gratified by seeing 2,000 captives thus drawn from the bosom of the lake, and laid prisoners at their feet. But when the feelings of the moment were passing away, Marmaduke took in his hands a bass that might have weighed 2 pounds, and after viewing it a moment, in melancholy musing, he turned to his daughter and observed: "This is a fearful expenditure of the choicest gifts of Providence. These fish, Bess, which thou seest lying in such piles before thee, and which by tomorrow evening will be rejected food on the meanest table in Templeton, are of a quality and flavor that, in other countries, would make them esteemed a luxury on the tables of princes or epicures. The world has no better fish than the bass of Otsego. It unites the richness of the shad to the firmness of the salmon. Author's insertion: of all the fish the writer has ever tasted, he thinks the one in question the best. End author's insertion. "But surely, dear sir," cried Elizabeth, "they must prove a great blessing to the country, and a powerful friend to the poor." "The poor are always prodigal, my child, where there is plenty, and seldom think of a provision against the morrow. But if there can be any excuse for destroying animals in this manner, it is in taking the bass. During the winter, you know, they are entirely protected from our assaults by the ice, for they refuse the hook, and during the hot months they are not seen. It is supposed they retreat to the deep and cool waters of the lake at that season, and it is only in the spring and autumn that for a few days they are to be found around the points where they are within the reach of a seine. But, like all the other treasures of the wilderness, they already begin to disappear before the wasteful extravagance of man." "Disappear, 'Duke, disappear!" exclaimed the sheriff. "If you don't call this appearing, I know not what you will. Here are a good 1,000 of the shiners, some hundreds of suckers, and a powerful quantity of other fry. But this is always the way with you, Marmaduke. First it's the trees, then it's the deer, after that it's the maple sugar, and so on to the end of the chapter. One day you talk of canals through a country where there's a river or a lake every half-mile, just because the water won't run the way you wish it to go, and the next you say something about mines of coal, though any man who has good eyes like myself, I say with good eyes, can see more wood than would keep the city of London in fuel for 50 years. Wouldn't it, Benjamin?" "Why, for that, squire," said the steward, "London is no small place. If it was stretched on end, all the same as a town on one side of the river, it would cover some such matter as this here lake; though if I dar'st to say that the wood in sight might serve them a good turn, seeing that the Londoners mainly burn coal." "Now we are on the subject of coal, Judge Temple," interrupted the sheriff, "I have a thing of much importance to communicate to you, but I will defer it until tomorrow. I know that you intend riding into the eastern part of the patent, and I will accompany you, and conduct you to a spot where some of your projects may be realized. We will say no more now, for there are listeners, but a secret has this evening been revealed to me, 'Duke, that is of much more consequence to your welfare than all your estate united." Marmaduke laughed at the important intelligence, to which in a variety of shapes he was accustomed; and the sheriff, with an air of great dignity, as if pitying his want of faith, proceeded in the business more immediately before them. As the labor of drawing the net had been very great, he directed one party of his men to commence throwing the fish into piles, preparatory to the usual division, while another, under the superintendence of Benjamin, prepared the seine for a second haul. Chapter 23. Recording by Bill Borst. Of the Pioneers, or the Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 24. While from its margin, terrible to tell, 3 sailors with their gallant boatswain fell. Falconer. While the fishermen were employed in making the preparations for an equitable division of the spoil, Elizabeth and her friend strolled a short distance from the group, along the shore of the lake. After reaching a point to which even the brightest of the occasional gleams of the fire did not extend, they turned, and paused a moment, in contemplation of the busy and lively party they had left, and of the obscurity which, like the gloom of oblivion, seemed to envelop the rest of the creation. "This is indeed a subject for the pencil!" exclaimed Elizabeth. "Observe the countenance of that wood chopper, while he exults in presenting a larger fish than common to my cousin sheriff; and see, Louisa, how handsome and considerate my dear father looks by the light of that fire, where he stands viewing the havoc of the game. He seems melancholy, as if he actually thought that a day of retribution was to follow this hour of abundance and prodigality. Would they not make a picture, Louisa?" "You know that I am ignorant of all such accomplishments, Miss Temple." "Call me by my Christian name," interrupted Elizabeth. "This is not a place, neither is this a scene for forms." "Well, then, if I may venture an opinion," said Louisa timidly, "I should think it might indeed make a picture. The selfish earnestness of that Kirby over his fish would contrast finely with the expression of Mr. Edwards' face. I hardly know what to call it, but it is you know what I would say, dear Elizabeth." "You do me too much credit, Miss Grant," said the heiress. "I am no diviner of thoughts, or interpreter of expressions." There was certainly nothing harsh or even cold in the manner of the speaker, but still it repressed the conversation, and they continued to stroll still farther from the party, retaining each other's arm, but observing a profound silence. Elizabeth, perhaps conscious of the improper phraseology of her last speech, or perhaps excited by the new object that met her gaze, was the first to break the awkward cessation in the discourse, by exclaiming, "Look, Louisa, we are not alone. There are fishermen lighting a fire on the other side of the lake, immediately opposite to us. It must be in front of the cabin of Leatherstocking." Through the obscurity, which prevailed most immediately under the eastern mountain, a small and uncertain light was plainly to be seen, though, as it was occasionally lost to the eye, it seemed struggling for existence. They observed it to move, and sensibly to lower, as it carried down the descent of the bank to the shore. Here, in a very short time, its flame gradually expanded and grew brighter, until it became the size of a man's head, when it continued to shine a steady ball of fire. Such an object, lighted as it were by magic, under the brow of the mountain, and in that retired and unfrequented place, gave double interest to the beauty and singularity of its appearance. It did not at all resemble the large and unsteady light of their own fire, being much more clear and bright, and retaining its size and shape with perfect uniformity. There are moments when the best regulated minds are more or less subjected to the injurious impressions which few have escaped in infancy, and Elizabeth smiled at her own weakness, while she remembered the idle tales which were circulated through the village, at the expense of the Leatherstocking. The same ideas seized her companion, and at the same instant, for Louisa pressed nearer to her friend, as she said in a low voice, stealing a timid glance toward the bushes and trees that overhung the bank near them, "Did you ever hear the singular ways of this Natty spoken of, Miss Temple? They say that, in his youth, he was an Indian warrior, or, what is the same thing, a white man leagued with the savages, and it is thought he has been concerned in many of their inroads, in the old wars." "The thing is not at all improbable," returned Elizabeth. "He is not alone in that particular." "No, surely; but is it not strange that he is so cautious with his hut? He never leaves it without fastening it in a remarkable manner, and in several instances, when the children, or even the men of the village, have wished to seek a shelter there from the storms, he has been known to drive them from his door with rudeness and threats. That surely is singular to this country." "It is certainly not very hospitable, but we must remember his aversion to the customs of civilized life. You heard my father say, a few days since, how kindly he was treated by him on his first visit to his place." Elizabeth paused, and smiled with an expression of peculiar archness, though the darkness hid its meaning from her companion, as she continued, "Besides, he certainly admits the visits of Mr. Edwards, whom we both know to be far from a savage." To this speech Louisa made no reply, but continued gazing on the object which had elicited her remarks. In addition to the bright and circular flame was now to be seen a fainter, though a vivid light, of an equal diameter to the other at the upper end, but which, after extending downward for many feet, gradually tapered to a point at its lower extremity. A dark space was plainly visible between the two, and the new illumination was placed beneath the other, the whole forming an appearance not unlike an inverted note of admiration. It was soon evident that the latter was nothing but the reflection, from the water, of the former, and that the object, whatever it might be, was advancing across, or rather over, the lake, for it seemed to be several feet above its surface, in a direct line with themselves. Its motion was amazingly rapid, the ladies having hardly discovered that it was moving at all, before the waving light of a flame was discerned, losing its regular shape, while it increased in size as it approached. "It appears to be supernatural," whispered Louisa, beginning to retrace her steps toward the party. "It is beautiful!" exclaimed Elizabeth. A brilliant, though waving flame was now plainly visible, gracefully gliding over the lake, and throwing its light on the water in such a manner as to tinge it slightly though in the air. So strong was the contrast, the darkness seemed to have the distinctness of material substances, as if the fire were embedded in a setting of ebony. This appearance, however, gradually wore off, and the rays from the torch struck out and enlightened the atmosphere in front of it, leaving the background in a darkness that was more impenetrable than ever. "Ho, Natty! Is that you?" shouted the sheriff. "Paddle in, old boy, and I'll give you a mess of fish that is fit to place before the governor." The light suddenly changed its direction, and a long and slightly built boat hove up out of the gloom, while the red glare fell on the weather-beaten features of the Leatherstocking, whose tall person was seen erect in the frail vessel, wielding, with the grace of an experienced boatman, a long fishing spear, which he held by its centre, first dropping one end and then the other into the water, to aid in propelling the little canoe of bark, we will not say through, but over the water. At the farther end of the vessel a form was faintly seen, guiding its motions, and using a paddle with the ease of one who felt there was no necessity for exertion. The Leatherstocking struck his spear lightly against the short staff which upheld, on a rude grating framed of old hoops of iron, the knots of pine that composed the fuel, and the light, which glared high, for an instant fell on the swarthy features and dark, glancing eyes of Mohegan. The boat glided along the shore until it arrived opposite the fishing ground, when it again changed its direction and moved on to the land, with a motion so graceful, and yet so rapid, that it seemed to possess the power of regulating its own progress. The water in front of the canoe was hardly ruffled by its passage, and no sound betrayed the collision, when the light fabric shot on the gravelly beach for nearly half its length, Natty receding a step or two from its bow, in order to facilitate the landing. "Approach, Mohegan," said Marmaduke. "Approach, Leatherstocking, and load your canoe with bass. It would be a shame to assail the animals with the spear, when such multitudes of victims lie here, that will be lost as food for the want of mouths to consume them." "No, no, Judge," returned Natty, his tall figure stalking over the narrow beach, and ascending to the little grassy bottom where the fish were laid in piles. "I eat of no man's wasty ways. I strike my spear into the eels or the trout when I crave the creature; but I wouldn't be helping to such a sinful kind of fishing for the best rifle that was ever brought out from the old countries. If they had fur, like the beaver, or you could tan their hides like a buck, something might be said in favor of taking them by the thousand with your nets. But as God made them for man's food, and for no other discernible reason, I call it sinful and wasty to catch more than can be eat." "Your reasoning is mine. For once, old hunter, we agree in opinion, and I heartily wish we could make a convert of the sheriff. A net of half the size of this would supply the whole village with fish for a week at one haul." The Leatherstocking did not relish this alliance in sentiment, and he shook his head doubtingly as he answered: "No, no, we are not much of one mind, Judge, or you'd never turn good hunting grounds into stumpy pastures, and you fish and hunt out of rule. But, to me, the flesh is sweeter where the creature has some chance for its life. For that reason, I always use a single ball, even if it be at a bird or a squirrel. Besides, it saves lead; for when a body knows how to shoot, one piece of lead is enough for all, except hard-lived animals." The sheriff heard these opinions with great indignation, and when he completed the last arrangement for the division, by carrying with his own hands a trout of a large size, and placing it on 4 different piles in succession, as his vacillating ideas of justice required, gave vent to his spleen. "A very pretty confederacy, indeed! Judge Temple, the landlord and owner of a township, with Nathaniel Bumppo, a lawless squatter, and professed deer killer, in order to preserve the game of the county. But, 'Duke, when I fish, I fish. So away, boys, for another haul, and we'll send out wagons and carts in the morning to bring in our prizes." Marmaduke appeared to understand that all opposition to the will of the sheriff would be useless, and he strolled from the fire to the place where the canoe of the hunters lay, whither the ladies and Oliver Edwards had already preceded him. Curiosity induced the females to approach this spot, but it was a different motive that led the youth thither. Elizabeth examined the light, ashen timbers and thin bark covering of the canoe, in admiration of its neat but simple execution, and with wonder that any human being could be so daring as to trust his life in so frail a vessel. But the youth explained to her the buoyant properties of the boat, and its perfect safety when under proper management, adding, in such glowing terms, a description of the manner in which the fish were struck with the spear, that she changed suddenly from an apprehension of the danger of the excursion to a desire to participate in its pleasures. She even ventured a proposition to that effect to her father, laughing at the same time at her own wish, and accusing herself of acting under a woman's caprice. "Say not so, Bess," returned the Judge. "I would have you above the idle fears of a silly girl. These canoes are the safest kind of boats to those who have skill and steady nerves. I have crossed the broadest part of the Oneida in one much smaller than this." "And I the Ontary," interrupted the Leatherstocking, "and that with squaws in the canoe, too. But the Delaware women are used to the paddle, and are good hands in a boat of this nature. If the young lady would like to see an old man strike a trout for his breakfast, she is welcome to a seat. John will say the same, seeing that he built the canoe, which was only launched yesterday; for I'm not over curious at such small work as brooms, and basket making, and other like Indian trades." Natty gave Elizabeth one of his significant laughs, with a kind of nod of the head, when he concluded his invitation, but Mohegan, with the native grace of an Indian, approached, and taking her soft white hand into his own swarthy and wrinkled palms, said: "Come, granddaughter of Miquon, and John will be glad. Trust the Indian; his head is old, though his hand is not steady. The Young Eagle will go, and see that no harm hurts his sister." "Mr. Edwards," said Elizabeth, blushing slightly, "your friend Mohegan has given a promise for you. Do you redeem the pledge?" "With my life, if necessary, Miss Temple," cried the youth, with fervor. "The sight is worth some little apprehension, for of real danger there is none. I will go with you and Miss Grant, however, to save appearances." "With me!" exclaimed Louisa. "No, not with me, Mr. Edwards. Nor surely do you mean to trust yourself in that slight canoe." "But I shall, for I have no apprehensions any longer," said Elizabeth, stepping into the boat, and taking a seat where the Indian directed. "Mr. Edwards, you may remain, as three do seem to be enough for such an egg-shell." "It shall hold a fourth," cried the young man, springing to her side, with a violence that nearly shook the weak fabric of the vessel asunder. "Pardon me, Miss Temple, that I do not permit these venerable Karens to take you to the shades unattended by your genius." "Is it a good or evil spirit?" asked Elizabeth. "Good to you." "And mine," added the maiden, with an air that strangely blended pique with satisfaction. But the motion of the canoe gave rise to new ideas, and fortunately afforded a good excuse to the young man to change the discourse. It appeared to Elizabeth that they glided over the water by magic, so easy and graceful was the manner in which Mohegan guided his little bark. A slight gesture with his spear indicated the way in which Leatherstocking wished to go, and a profound silence was preserved by the whole party, as the precaution necessary to the success of their fishery. At that point of the lake the water shoaled regularly, differing in this particular altogether from those parts where the mountains rose nearly in perpendicular precipices from the beach. There the largest vessels could have lain, with their yards interlocked with the pines, while here a scanty growth of rushes lifted their tops above the lake, gently curling the waters, as their bending heads waved with the passing breath of the night air. It was at the shallow points only that the bass could be found, or the net cast with success. Elizabeth saw thousands of these fish swimming in shoals along the shallow and warm waters of the shore, for the flaring light of their torch laid bare the mysteries of the lake, as plainly as if the limpid sheet of the Otsego was but another atmosphere. Every instant she expected to see the impending spear of Leatherstocking darting into the thronging hosts that were rushing beneath her, where it would seem that a blow could not go amiss, and where, as her father had already said, the prize that would be obtained was worthy any epicure. But Natty had his peculiar habits, and it would seem his peculiar tastes also. His tall stature, and his erect posture, enabled him to see much farther than those who were seated in the bottom of the canoe, and he turned his head warily in every direction, frequently bending his body forward and straining his vision, as if desirous of penetrating the water that surrounded their boundary of light. At length his anxious scrutiny was rewarded with success, and waving his spear from the shore, he said in a cautious tone: "Send her outside the bass, John. I see a laker there, that has run out of the school. It's seldom one finds such a creature in shallow water, where a spear can touch it." Mohegan gave a wave of assent with his hand, and in the next instant the canoe was without the run of the bass, and in water nearly 20 feet in depth. A few additional knots were laid on the grating, and the light penetrated to the bottom. Elizabeth then saw a fish of unusual size floating above small pieces of logs and sticks. The animal was only distinguishable, at that distance, by a slight but almost imperceptible motion of its fins and tail. The curiosity excited by this unusual exposure of the secrets of the lake seemed to be mutual between the heiress of the land and the lord of these waters, for the salmon trout soon announced his interest by raising his head and body for a few degrees above a horizontal line, and then dropping them again into a horizontal position. "Whist, whist," said Natty in a low voice, on hearing a slight sound made by Elizabeth in bending over the side of the canoe in curiosity. "'Tis a skeary animal, and it's a far stroke for a spear. My handle is but 14 foot, and the creatur' lies a good 18 from the top of the water; but I'll try him, for he's a 10-pounder." While speaking, the Leatherstocking was poising and directing his weapon. Elizabeth saw the bright polished tines as they slowly and silently entered the water, where the refraction pointed them many degrees from the true direction of the fish, and she thought that the intended victim saw them also, as he seemed to increase the play of his tail and fins, though without moving his station. At the next instant the tall body of Natty bent to the water's edge, and the handle of his spear disappeared in the lake. The long, dark streak of the gliding weapon, and the little bubbling vortex which followed its rapid flight, were easily to be seen. But it was not until the handle shot again into the air by its own reaction, and its master, catching it in his hand, threw its tines uppermost, that Elizabeth was acquainted with the success of the blow. A fish of great size was transfixed by the barbed steel, and was very soon shaken from its impaled situation into the bottom of the canoe. "That will do, John," said Natty, raising his prize by one of his fingers, and exhibiting it before the torch. "I shall not strike another blow to night." The Indian again waved his hand, and replied with the simple and energetic monosyllable of "Good." Elizabeth was awakened by the trance created by this scene, and by gazing in that unusual manner at the bottom of the lake, by the hoarse sounds of Benjamin's voice, and the dashing of oars, as the heavier boat of the seine drawers approached the spot where the canoe lay, dragging after it the folds of the net. Haul off, Master Bumppo," cried Benjamin. "Your top light frightens the fish, who see the net and sheer off soundings. A fish knows as much as a horse, or for that matter more, seeing that it's brought up on the water. Haul off, Master Bumppo, haul off, I say, and give a wide berth to the seine." Mohegan guided their little canoe to a point where the movements of the fishermen could be observed, without interruption to the business, and then suffered it to lie quietly in the water, looking like an imaginary vessel floating in air. There appeared to be much ill humor among the party in the batteau, for the directions of Benjamin were not only frequent, but issued in a voice that partook largely of dissatisfaction. "Pull larboard oar, will you, Master Kirby?" cried the old seaman. "Pull larboard best. It would puzzle the oldest admiral in the British fleet to cast this here net fair with a wake like a corkscrew. Full starboard, boy; pull starboard oar, with a will." "Harkee, Mister Pump," said Kirby, ceasing to row, and speaking with sonic spirit, "I'm a man that likes civil language and decent treatment, such as is right 'twixt man and man. If you want us to go hoy, say so, and hoy I'll go, for the benefit of the company, but I'm not used to being ordered about like dumb cattle." "Who's dumb cattle?" echoed Benjamin, fiercely, turning his forbidding face to the glare of light from the canoe, and exhibiting every feature teeming with the expression of disgust. "If you want to come aft and run the boat round, come and be damned, and pretty steerage you'll make of it. There's but another heave of the net in the stern sheets, and we're clear of the thing. Give way, will ye, and shoot her ahead for a fathom or two, and if you catch me afloat again with such a horse marine as yourself, why, rate me a ship's jackass, that's all." Probably encouraged by the prospect of a speedy termination to his labor, the wood chopper resumed his oar, and under strong excitement gave a stroke that not only cleared the boat of the net, but of the steward at the same instant. Benjamin had stood on the little platform that held the seine, in the stern of the boat, and the violent whirl occasioned by the vigor of the wood chopper's arm completely destroyed his balance. The position of the lights rendered objects in the batteau distinguishable, both from the canoe and the shore, and the heavy fall on the water drew all eyes to the steward, as he lay struggling for a moment in sight. A loud burst of merriment, to which the lungs of Kirby contributed no small part, broke out like a chorus of laughter, and ran along the eastern mountain in echoes, until it died away in distant, mocking mirth among the rocks and woods. The body of the steward was seen slowly to disappear, as was expected, but when the light waves, which had been raised by his fall, began to sink in calmness, and the water finally closed over his head, unbroken and still, a very different feeling pervaded the spectators. "How fare you, Benjamin?" shouted Richard from the shore. "The dumb devil can't swim a stroke!" exclaimed Kirby, rising, and beginning to throw aside his clothes. "Paddle up, Mohegan," cried young Edwards. "The light will show us where he lies, and I will dive for the body." "Oh, save him! For God's sake, save him!" exclaimed Elizabeth, bowing her head on the side of the canoe in horror. A powerful and dexterous sweep of Mohegan's paddles sent the canoe directly over the spot where the steward had fallen, and a loud shout from the Leatherstocking announced that he saw the body. "Steady the boat while I dive!" again cried Edwards. "Gently, lad, gently," said Natty. "I'll spear the creature up in half the time, and no risk to anybody." The form of Benjamin was lying about half way to the bottom, grasping with both hands some broken rushes. The blood of Elizabeth curdled to her heart, as she saw the figure of a fellow creature thus extended under an immense sheet of water, apparently in motion by the undulations of the dying waves, with its face and hands, viewed by that light, and through the medium of the fluid, already colored with hues like death. At the same instant she saw the shining tines of Natty's spear approaching the head of the sufferer, and entwining themselves rapidly and dexterously in the hairs of his queue and the cape of his coat. The body was now raised slowly, looking ghastly and grim as its features turned upward to the light and approached the surface. The arrival of the nostrils of Benjamin into their own atmosphere was announced by a breathing that would have done credit to a porpoise. For a moment Natty held the steward suspended, with his head just above the water, while his eyes slowly opened and stared about him, as if he thought that he had reached a new and unexplored country. As all the parties acted and spoke together, much less time was consumed in the occurrence of these events than in their narration. To bring the batteau to the end of the spear, and to raise the form of Benjamin into the boat, and for the whole party to regain the shore, required but a minute. Kirby, aided by Richard, whose anxiety induced him to run into the water to meet his favorite assistant, carried the motionless steward up the bank, and seated him before the fire, while the sheriff proceeded to order the most approved measures then in use for the resuscitation of the drowned. "Run, Billy," he cried, "to the village, and bring up the rum hogshead that lies before the door, in which I am making vinegar, and be quick, boy. Don't stay to empty the vinegar, and stop at Mr. Le Quoi's, and buy a paper of tobacco and half a dozen pipes, and ask Remarkable for some salt and one of her flannel petticoats, and ask Dr. Todd to send his lancet, and to come himself, and ha! Duke, what are you about? Would you strangle a man who is full of water, by giving him rum? Help me to open his hand, that I may pat it." All this time Benjamin sat with his muscles fixed, his mouth shut, and his hands clinching the rushes which he had seized in the confusion of the moment, and which, as he held fast, like a true seaman, had been the means of preventing his body from rising again to the surface. His eyes, however, were open, and stared wildly on the group about the fire, while his lungs were playing like a blacksmith's bellows, as if to compensate themselves for the minute of inaction to which they had been subjected. As he kept his lips compressed, with a most inveterate determination, the air was compelled to pass through his nostrils, and he rather snorted than breathed, and in such a manner that nothing but the excessive agitation of the sheriff could at all justify his precipitous orders. The bottle, applied to the steward's lips by Marmaduke, acted like a charm. His mouth opened instinctively, his hands dropped the rushes, and seized the glass, his eyes raised from their horizontal stare to the heavens, and the whole man was lost, for a moment, in a new sensation. Unhappily for the propensity of the steward, breath was as necessary after one of these draughts as after his submersion, and the time at length arrived when he was compelled to let go the bottle. "Why, Benjamin," roared the sheriff, "you amaze me, for a man of your experience in drownings to act so foolishly. Just now you were half full of water, and now you are—" "Full of grog," interrupted the steward, his features settling down with amazing flexibility into their natural economy. "But d'ye see, squire, I kept my hatches close, and it's but little water that ever gets into my scuttle-butt. Harkee, Master Kirby, I've followed the salt water for the better part of a man's life, and have seen some navigation on the fresh, but this here matter I will say in your favor, and that is, that you're the awkwardest green 'un that ever straddled a boat's thwart. Them that likes you for a shipmate may sail with you, and no thanks, but damn me if I even walk on the lake shore in your company. For why? You'd as lief drown a man as one of them there fish, not to throw a Christian creatur' so much as a rope's end when he was adrift, and no life buoy in sight. Natty Bumppo, give us your fist. There's them that says you're an Indian and a scalper, but you've served me a good turn, and you may set me down for a friend, though it would have been more ship-shape like to lower the bight of a rope or running bow-line below me, than to seize an old seaman by his head-lanyard. But I suppose you are used to taking men by the hair, and seeing you did me good instead of harm thereby, why, it's the same thing, d'ye see?" Marmaduke prevented any reply, and, assuming the action of matters with a dignity and discretion that at once silenced all opposition from his cousin, Benjamin was dispatched to the village by land, and the net was hauled to shore in such a manner that the fish for once escaped its meshes with impunity. The division of the spoils was made in the ordinary manner, by placing one of the party with his back to the game, who named the owner of each pile. Bill Kirby stretched his large frame on the grass by the side of the fire, as sentinel until morning, over net and fish, and the remainder of the party embarked in the batteau to return to the village. The wood chopper was seen broiling his supper on the coals as they lost sight of the fire, and when the boat approached the shore, the torch of Mohican's canoe was shining again under the gloom of the eastern mountain. Its motion ceased suddenly. A scattering of brands was in the air, and then all remained dark, as the conjunction of night, forest, and mountain could render the scene. The thoughts of Elizabeth wandered from the youth, who was holding a canopy of shawls over herself and Louisa, to the hunter and the Indian warrior, and she felt an awakening curiosity to visit a hut, where men of such different habits and temperament were drawn together as by common impulse. Chapter 24. Recording by Bill Borst. Chapter 25 of the Pioneers, or the Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 25. Cease all this parlance about hills and dales. None listen to thy scenes of boyish frolic. Fond dotard, with such tickled ears as thou dost come to thy tale. Duo. Mr. Jones arose on the following morning with the sun, and, ordering his own and Marmaduke's steeds to be saddled, he proceeded with a countenance big with some business of unusual moment to the apartment of the judge. The door was unfastened, and Richard entered with the freedom that characterized not only the intercourse between the cousins, but the ordinary manners of the sheriff. "Well, 'Duke, to horse," he cried, "and I will explain to you my meaning in the allusions I made last night. David says in the Psalms no, it was Solomon, but it was all in the family. Solomon said there was a time for all things, and in my humble opinion, a fishing party is not the moment for discussing important subjects. Ha! Why, what the devil ails you, Marmaduke? Ain't you well? Let me feel your pulse. My grandfather, you know—" "Quite well in the body, Richard," interrupted the judge, repulsing his cousin, who was about to assume the functions that rightly belonged to Dr. Todd, "but ill at heart. I received letters by the post last night, after we returned from the point, and this among the number." The sheriff took the letter, but without turning his eyes on the writing, for he was examining the appearance of the other with astonishment. From the face of his cousin the gaze of Richard wandered to the table, which was covered with letters, packets, and newspapers, then to the apartment and all it contained. On the bed there was the impression that had been made by a human form, but the coverings were unmoved, and everything indicated that the occupant of the room had passed a sleepless night. The candles had burned to the sockets, and had evidently extinguished themselves in their own fragments. Marmaduke had drawn his curtains, and opened both the shutters and the sashes, to admit the balmy air of a spring morning; but his pale cheek, his quivering lip, and his sunken eye presented altogether so very different an appearance from the usual calm, manly, and cheerful aspect of the Judge, that the sheriff grew each moment more and more bewildered with astonishment. At length Richard found time to cast his eyes on the direction of the letter, which he still held unopened, crumpling it in his hand. "What! A ship letter!" he exclaimed, "and from England! Ha! 'Duke, there must be news of importance indeed." "Read it," said Marmaduke, pacing the floor in excessive agitation. Richard, who commonly thought aloud, was unable to read a letter without suffering part of its contents to escape him in audible sounds. So much of the epistle as was divulged in that manner we shall lay before the reader, accompanied by the passing remarks of the sheriff. "London, February 12th, 1793. What a devil of a passage she had! But the wind has been northwest for 6 weeks, until within the last fortnight. Sir, your favors of August 10th, September 23rd, and of December 1st, were received in due season, and the first answered by return of packet. Since the receipt of the last, Here a long passage was rendered indistinct by a kind of humming noise by the sheriff. "I grieve to say that, bad enough to be sure, but trusts that a merciful Providence has seen fit, seems to be a good, pious sort of a man, 'Duke. Belongs to the established church, I dare say. Vessel sailed from Falmouth on or about the 1st September of last year, and, if anything should transpire on this afflicting subject, shall not fail, really a good-hearted man for a lawyer, but can communicate nothing further at present. The National Convention, unfortunate Lewis, example of your Washington, a very sensible man, I declare, and none of your crazy Democrats. Our gallant navy, under our most excellent monarch. I, a good man enough, that King George, but bad advisers. I beg to conclude with assurances of my perfect respect. Andrew Holt. Andrew Holt, a very sensible, feeling man, this Mr. Andrew Holt. But the writer of evil tidings. What will you do next, cousin Marmaduke?" "What can I do, Richard, but trust to time, and the will of Heaven. Here is another letter from Connecticut, but it only repeats the substance of the last. There is but one consoling reflection to be gathered from the English news, which is, that my last letter was received by him before the ship sailed." "This is bad enough indeed, 'Duke, bad enough indeed; and away go all my plans of putting wings to the house, to the devil. I had made arrangements for a ride to introduce you to something of a very important nature. You know how much you think of mines." "Talk not of mines," interrupted the Judge. "There is a sacred duty to be performed, and that without delay. I must devote this day to writing." "And thou must be my assistant, Richard. It will not do to employ Oliver in a matter of such secrecy and interest." "No, no, 'Duke," cried the sheriff, squeezing his hand. "I am your man, just now. We are sister's children, and blood, after all, is the best cement to make friendships stick together. Well, well, there is no hurry about the silver mine just now. Another time will do as well. We shall want Dirky Van, I suppose." Marmaduke assented to this indirect question, and the sheriff relinquished all his intentions on the subject of the ride, and, repairing to the breakfast parlor, he dispatched a messenger to require the immediate presence of Dirk Van der School. The village of Templeton, at that time, supported but 2 lawyers, one of whom was introduced to our readers in the bar-room of the Bold Dragoon, and the other was the gentleman of whom Richard spoke by the friendly yet familiar appellation of Dirk, or Dirky Van. Great good nature, a very tolerable share of skill in his profession, and, considering the circumstances, no contemptible degree of honesty, were the principal ingredients in the character of this man, who was known to the settlers as Squire Vanderschool, and sometimes by the flattering though anomalous title of the Dutch, or honest lawyer. We would not wish to mislead our readers in their conceptions of any of our characters, and we therefore feel it necessary to add that the adjective in the preceding agnomen of Mr. Vanderschool was used in direct reference to its substantive. Our orthodox friends need not be told that all the merit in this world is comparative, and, once for all, we desire to say that where any thing which involves qualities or characters is asserted, we must be understood to mean under the circumstances. During the remainder of the day the judge was closeted with his cousin and his lawyer, and no one else was admitted to his apartment, excepting his daughter. The deep distress that so evidently affected Marmaduke was in some measure communicated to Elizabeth also, for a look of dejection shaded her intelligent features, and the buoyancy of her animated spirits was sensibly softened. Once on that day, young Edwards, who was a wondering and observant spectator of the sudden alteration produced in the heads of the family, detected a tear stealing over the cheek of Elizabeth, and suffusing her bright eyes with a softness that did not always belong to their expression. "Have any evil tidings been received, Miss Temple?" he inquired, with an interest and voice that caused Louisa Grant to raise her head from her needlework with a quickness at which she instantly blushed herself. "I would offer my services to your father if, as I suspect, he needs an agent in some distant place, and I thought it would give you relief." "We have certainly heard bad news," returned Elizabeth, "and it may be necessary that my father should leave home for a short period, unless I can persuade him to trust my cousin Richard with the business, whose absence from the country just at this time, too, might be an expedient." The youth paused a moment, and the blood gathered slowly to his temples as he continued: "If it be of a nature that I could execute, it is such as can only be confided to one we know, one of ourselves. Surely you know me, Miss Temple," he added, with a warmth that he seldom exhibited, but which did sometimes escape him in the moments of their frank communications. "Have I lived 5 months under your roof to be a stranger?" Elizabeth was engaged with her needle also, and she bent her head to one side, affecting to arrange her muslin; but her hand shook, her color heightened, and her eyes lost their moisture in an expression of ungovernable interest, as she said: "How much do we know of you, Mr. Edwards?" "How much!" echoed the youth, gazing from the speaker to the mild countenance of Louisa, that was also illuminated with curiosity. "How much have I been so long an inmate with you and not known?" The head of Elizabeth turned slowly from its affected position, and the look of confusion that had blended so strongly with an expression of interest changed to a smile. "We know you, sir, indeed. You are called Mr. Oliver Edwards. I understand that you have informed my friend Miss Grant that you are a native—" "Elizabeth!" exclaimed Louisa, blushing to the eyes, and trembling like an aspen. "You misunderstood me, dear Miss Temple. It was only a conjecture. Besides, if Mr. Edwards is related to the natives, why should we reproach him? In what are we better? At least I, who am the child of a poor and unsettled clergyman." Elizabeth shook her head doubtingly, and even laughed, but made no reply, until, observing the melancholy which pervaded the countenance of her companion, who was thinking of the poverty and labors of her father, she continued: "Nay, Louisa, humility carries you too far. The daughter of a minister of the church can have no superiors. Neither I nor Mr. Edwards is quite your equal, unless," she added, again smiling, "he is in secret a king." "A faithful servant of the King of kings, Miss Temple, is inferior to none on earth," said Louisa. "But his honors are his own. I am only the child of a poor and friendless man, and can claim no other distinction. Why, then, should I feel myself elevated above Mr. Edwards, because perhaps he is only very, very distantly related to John Mohegan?" Glances of a very comprehensive meaning were exchanged between the heiress and the young man, as Louisa betrayed, while vindicating his lineage, the reluctance with which she admitted his alliance with the old warrior; but not even a smile at the simplicity of their companion was indulged in by either. "On reflection, I must acknowledge that my situation here is somewhat equivocal," said Edwards, "though I may be said to have purchased it with my blood." "The blood, too, of one of the native lords of the soil," cried Elizabeth, who evidently put little faith in his aboriginal descent. "Do I bear the marks of my lineage so very plainly impressed on my appearance? I am dark, but not very red; not more so than common." "Rather more so just now." "I am sure, Miss Temple," cried Louisa, "you cannot have taken much notice of Mr. Edwards. His eyes are not so black as Mohicans, or even your own, nor is his hair." "Very possibly, then, I can lay claim to the same descent. It would be a great relief to my mind to think so, for I own that I grieve when I see old Mohegan walking about these lands like the ghost of one of their ancient possessors, and feel how small is my own right to possess them." "Do you?" cried the youth, with a vehemence that startled the ladies. "I do, indeed," returned Elizabeth, after suffering a moment to pass in surprise. "But what can I do? What can my father do? Should we offer the old man a home and a maintenance, his habits would compel him to refuse us. Neither were we so silly as to wish such a thing, could we convert these clearings and farms again into hunting grounds, as the Leatherstocking would wish to see them." "You speak the truth, Miss Temple," said Edwards. "What can you do, indeed? But there is one thing that I am certain you can and will do when you become the mistress of these beautiful valleys. Use your wealth with indulgence to the poor, and charity to the needy. Indeed, you can do no more." "And that will be doing a good deal," said Louisa, smiling in her turn; "but there will, doubtless, be one to take the direction of such things from her hands. I am not about to disclaim matrimony like a silly girl, who dreams of nothing else from morn till night; but I am a nun here, without the vow of celibacy. Where shall I find a husband in these forests?" "There is none, Miss Temple," said Edwards quickly; "there is none who has a right to aspire to you, and I know that you will wait to be sought by your equal, or die as you live, loved, respected, and admired by all who know you." The young man seemed to think that he had said all that was required by gallantry, for he arose, and, taking his hat, hurried from the apartment. Perhaps Louisa thought that he had said more than was necessary, for she sighed, with an aspiration so low that it was scarcely audible to herself, and bent her head over her work again; and it is possible that Miss Temple wished to hear more, for her eyes continued fixed for a minute on the door through which the young man had passed, then glanced quickly toward her companion, when the long silence that succeeded manifested how much zest may be given to the conversation of two maidens under 18, by the presence of a youth of 23. The first person encountered by Mr. Edwards, as he rather rushed than walked from the house, was the little square-built lawyer, with a large bundle of papers under his arm, a pair of green spectacles on his nose, with glasses at the sides, as if to multiply his power of detecting frauds by additional organs of vision. Mr. Van der School was a well-educated man, but of slow comprehension, who had imbibed a wariness in his speeches and actions, from having suffered by his collisions with his more mercurial and apt brethren, who had laid the foundations of their practice in the Eastern courts, and who had sucked in shrewdness with their mother's milk. The caution of this gentleman was exhibited in his actions, by the utmost method and punctuality, tinctured with a good deal of timidity; and in his speeches, by a parenthetical style that frequently left to his auditors a long search after his meaning. "A good morning to you, Mr. Van der School," said Edwards. "It seems to be a busy day with us at the mansion house." "Good morning, Mr. Edwards, if that is your name, for, being a stranger, we have no other evidence of the fact than your own testimony, as I understand you have given it to Judge Temple." "Good morning, sir. It is apparently a busy day, but a man of your discretion need not be told, having doubtless discovered it of your own accord, that appearances are often deceitful. Up at the mansion house. Have you papers of consequence that will require copying? Can I be of assistance in any way?" There are papers, as doubtless you see, for your eyes are young by the outsides, that require copying. Well, then, I will accompany you to your office and receive such as are most needed, and by night I shall have them done if there be much haste. I shall always be glad to see you, sir, at my office, as in duty bound, not that it is obligatory to receive any man within your dwelling, unless so inclined, which is a castle, according to the forms of politeness, or at any other place, but the papers are most strictly confidential, and, as such, cannot be read by any one, unless so directed by Judge Temple's solemn injunctions, and are invisible to all eyes, excepting those whose duties, I mean assumed duties, require it of them. Well, sir, as I perceive that I can be of no service, I wish you another good morning, but beg you will remember that I am quite idle just now, and I wish you would intimate as much to Judge Temple, and make him a tender of my services in any part of the world, unless it be far from Templeton. I will make the communication, sir, in your name, with your own qualifications, as your agent. Good morning, sir. But state proceedings, Mr. Edwards, so called, for a moment. Do you wish me to state the offer of travelling as a final contract, for which consideration has been received at former dates by sums advanced, which would be binding, or as a tender of services for which compensation is to be paid, according to future agreement between the parties, on performance of the conditions? Any way, said Edwards. He seems in distress, and I would assist him. The motive is good, sir, according to appearances, which are often deceitful on first impressions, and does you honor. I will mention your wish, young gentleman, as you now seem, and will not fail to communicate the answer by 5 o'clock P.M. of this present day, God willing, if you give me an opportunity so to do. The ambiguous nature of the situation and character of Mr. Edwards had rendered him an object of peculiar suspicion to the lawyer, and the youth was consequently too much accustomed to similar equivocal and guarded speeches to feel any unusual disgust at the present dialogue. He saw at once that it was the intention of the practitioner to conceal the nature of his business, even from the private secretary of Judge Temple, and he knew too well the difficulty of comprehending the meaning of Mr. Van der School, when the gentleman most wished to be luminous in his discourse, not to abandon all thoughts of a discovery, when he perceived that the attorney was endeavoring to avoid anything like an approach to a cross-examination. They parted at the gate, the lawyer walking with an important and hurried air toward his office, keeping his right hand firmly clinched on the bundle of papers. It must have been obvious to all our readers that the youth entertained an unusual and deeply seated prejudice against the character of the judge; but, owing to some counteracting cause, his sensations were now those of powerful interest in the state of his patron's present feelings, and in the cause of his secret uneasiness. He remained gazing after the lawyer until the door closed on both the bearer and the mysterious packet, when he returned slowly to the dwelling, and endeavored to forget his curiosity in the usual avocations of his office. When the judge made his reappearance in the circles of his family, his cheerfulness was tempered by a shade of melancholy that lingered for many days around his manly brow, but the magical progression of the season aroused him from his temporary apathy, and his smiles returned with the summer. The heats of the days, and the frequent occurrence of balmy showers, had completed in an incredibly short period the growth of plants which the lingering spring had so long retarded in the germ, and the woods presented every shade of green that the American forests know. The stumps in the cleared fields were already hidden beneath the wheat that was waving with every breath of the summer air, shining and changing its hues like velvet. During the continuance of his cousin's dejection, Mr. Jones forbore with much consideration to press on his attention a business that each hour was drawing nearer to the heart of the sheriff, and which, if any opinion could be formed by his frequent private conferences with the man who was introduced in these pages by the name of Jotham, at the bar-room of the Bold Dragoon, was becoming also of great importance. At length the sheriff ventured to allude again to the subject, and one evening, in the beginning of July, Marmaduke made him a promise of devoting the following day to the desired excursion. Chapter 25. Recording by Bill Borst.